I'm a part of a community called Soka Gakkai International, or SGI, and this is a global community-based network of over 11 million members across the world. It really spans almost 200 countries. And this group is essentially committed to dialogue based on the conviction that individual happiness and the realization of peace are linked. And it's really rooted in this faith of Nichiren Buddhism that says earthly desires lead to enlightenment. And, to put this kind of simply, earthly desires is, around suffering and the desires and cravings that maybe may cause suffering because we don't have them, as an example, like a new job or a new relationship. And enlightenment refers to happiness, or just like an enlightened higher life condition, state of life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Woven Wings Live. I'm your host, Gabe Crane. I'm joined by my co-host, Rahul Deedwania, as always. And today, our episode is about joining a spiritual community in the 21st century. And our guest today is Ketna Shankar, who is a product marketer and Buddhist practitioner in the Nichiren Buddhism in the Soka Gakkai International, and we'll find out more about that shortly. But our theme today is really about the experience and the choice to join and participate in a spiritual community, but in today's day and age. And three of us who are on the call today are, I think, broadly speaking, in the millennial generation. Really, it's an exploration today of what engaging with spiritual community, making commitments to spiritual community looks like in the complexities that we face in the third decade now of the 21st century. So with that in mind, Rahul, it's great to be with you again. And I'm curious, as a just opening question to you, is what's been your own experience engaging and committing, joining spiritual communities in your own life?
Thank you, Gabe, for the welcome as always. And my experience has been one that I can really only think about in my childhood, right? I think with my family, we were part of a community. We'd occasionally go to we're Hindu sort of by culture and by religious choice. And we would go to the temple every so often. We had sort of different Hindu communities that we were plugged into, as opposed to one that we were like always a part of or going to every week or anything like that. And so that's really what I associate with it. And as I've gotten older, really, even when I left to college and onwards, it's been a lot more ephemeral. I wouldn't say that I identify with any particular spiritual community, even if I identify with, Hindu or Buddhist philosophies. And what's more is I actually don't know that many people that are active members of spiritual communities. And part of me, then started to think like, okay, maybe that's something you discover at a different stage in your life, or maybe it's something generational where our generation on the whole, at least the urban portion of our generation is maybe less inclined. And there probably some truth, there's probably some truth to both of those things. But I think Ketna is an interesting example, right, of someone who actually has chosen that. And so I'm excited really just to learn about that story and sort of what is a way to think about that process and that journey and that commitment. And I'm curious what that sparks for you, Gabe, or what your experience has been with being a part of, whether it's a Jewish community or, your Qigong or Ren Shui community. I know we've talked about some of those things before, but just curious to hear what comes to you there.
It's really interesting hearing you share going back to childhood, because it makes me think about my own formative experiences in a Reform synagogue growing up. And as a child, that was not the most resonant place for me. It was a place where there was a lot of community. I still have friends that I went to preschool at the synagogue with. And so obviously it's been significant. And as time and life has gone on, as I've gotten older, the influence of that time has reverberated more than I probably expected as a child. But I also remember very much as a child feeling this kind of ambivalence and dissonance of a little bit of confusion of like, okay, this is this community that's all about spirituality or it's about this religion, but a lot of the folks practicing it or the way we talk about it is also kind of very modern or undercutting a lot of the traditional religious spiritual orientations. And as a child, I found that complexity a little hypocritical. As I've gotten older, I think I've appreciated some of the reasons for that and the real complexity that goes into religion and relating to spirituality in general, which of course we explore on this show. And in my adult life, what really comes to mind around this topic, I mean, there's a few different examples. I think I'm a little different from you in the sense that I feel like I have been not necessarily fully committed a lot of the time, but I feel like I've been in and out of different spiritual communities and traditions in my adult life. And one of the communities that have been most committed to and in is the Qigong community that you mentioned, Ren Shui. And I I'm less involved now, but I still feel connected to that tradition. And for some time I spent, for several years, I was going to retreats and teacher trainings and have a lot of rich relationships from that world and have gained a lot spiritually too. And I'm really curious to see where our conversation goes today with Kaitna, because for myself, some of the, I guess, baggage maybe that I bring into this conversation is the tension, the benefit that have felt from engaging in Ren Shui. I can say pretty unequivocally that being involved with that community and learning those practices and teachings in a deep, consistent way over years has really deepened my own spiritual sensibility and practice, and it nourishes me. It helps me in a number of ways. And so I definitely would not take that back or change it whatsoever. And then at the same time, as I said, I'm less engaged with the movement of the community itself, and probably from folks more deeply within that community, they might see that as me kind of falling off the wagon or not being as committed as I should be. But there's something about my modern sensibility that has a kind of resistance to getting pulled too much into any particular community, or where I start to feel that, and I'm not saying this about Ren Shui, but where I feel like it's becoming more enclaved or even cultish. And then I have this resistance to that and feel that, well, the diversity of traditions and that we get to experience in an age of globalization is very vital. And if I get too pulled into a community, then I kind of might lose track of that in a certain way. And so there's this tension there that I find myself navigating in my own life that I don't have an answer to, and that's kind of very interesting to me as we get into having Kaitna on our show today to see where that conversation might lead. On that note, I would like to introduce Kaitna Shankar, who is our guest today. And 8 years ago, Kaitna was drawn to Nichiren Buddhism in the Soka Gakkai International, or SGI, while she was living in New York and looking for meaning in her self-development. And she's been deeply engaged in this practice and taken on numerous leadership roles within this community, in particular helping support other young women in their lives and practice. And then in her day-to-day, Kaitna lives in San Francisco. She's a product marketer at Samsara, so really living a dynamic modern life alongside this deep engagement. And we're really lucky and grateful to have her with us today to share her experiences and insight. So Kaitna, thank you so much for being with us today, and welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much, Gabe and Rahul. And thank you both for sharing your journeys with spirituality. Really interesting to kind of hear about both of your guys' unique experience. And I'm excited to kind of delve in and answer some of those questions you brought up.
To start, Kaitna, just as a quick overview, we'd love to learn a little bit about the spiritual community that you're a part of. And so, what is the name? The high level philosophy, and just the nature of the spiritual community that you're a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a part of a community called Soka Gakkai International, or SGI. And this is a global community-based network of, over 11 million members across the world. It really spans almost 200 countries. And this group is essentially committed to dialogue based on the conviction that individual happiness and the realization of peace are linked. And it's really rooted in this faith of Nichiren Buddhism. We all know, Buddhism, there are many different forms of Buddhism. So this is Nichiren Buddhism, which is based off of Siddhartha Gautama, who was the original Buddha, the prince who left, and stories say that he found enlightenment under a Bodhi tree. This is Nichiren Buddhism, which is based off of his last sutra that he wrote called the Lotus Sutra before he passed away. And essentially, in the Lotus Sutra, it states that actually enlightenment is not, going off and secluding yourself from society and, meditating for hours on end to find enlightenment and the meaning of life. Actually, enlightenment is, living your day to day, like out in society, whether it's work, relationships, whatever it is. And enlightenment is essentially, really achieving this sustainable happiness based off of unlimited courage, wisdom, and compassion, which everyone inherently possesses. So it's really all about this, conviction that everyone inherently possesses their own Buddha nature. And it's really all about, digging underneath those layers of karma to, basically be able to find that Buddha nature in itself. So that is a little bit of what SGI Nichiren Buddhism is.
What was your process of encountering this community and joining it? I'm curious about your personal experience, how old you were, what was going on in your life at that time that led you to seek out this community and that made this community feel particularly resonant for you.
At this point, it was around 8 years ago, 2014. I was in my senior year of undergrad over at NYU. And earlier that summer, my grandmother had passed away really suddenly, just like really traumatic experience. And I think over time, my experiences, living far away in New York, which is on the, other side of the country from where I grew up, and kind of coupled with some of those experiences, as well as kind of knowing, kind of like taking a look around at my friendships in particular and seeing that these are some of my closest friendships that I've built over the past 4 years. And they ended up not being the most fulfilling ones that I thought they were. And kind of, realizing that my self-confidence was really at an all-time low. And it was almost like this moment where I felt like I had been building my life for so many years in New York, and it wasn't exactly the life that I really wanted. And so I was just like deeply unhappy, falling into depression, self-confidence at an all-time low. Never felt more alone, candidly. Kind of with that, I actually, one day was walking around and I ran into a former co-student, shall I say, one of my friends, who was on the board of a club with me at NYU. And I remember she was in a hurry to go to a Buddhist meeting. And, I'd actually known about this because growing up, my mom had actually been a part of SGI. And I had kind of grown up seeing her chant over the years. And she had wanted me to kind of, always join. And I was never really interested. And during this kind of part of my life, I remember my mom would be on the phone with me and she would try to always encourage me to go to a Buddhist meeting in New York. And I wasn't really into it. But then when I ran into my friend and she said she was going to a Buddhist meeting, I just, I asked her, I was like, wait, do you chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo? Which, I'm happy to explain how that's kind of a part of Nichiren Buddhism and SGI. To which she exclaimed, oh, yes, I do. Like, how do you know about it? And I was like, oh, my mom chants. Like, what a small world. And so before she ran off, she invited me to go to a meeting with her. And finally, one Sunday after, many tears and encouragement from my mom, I decided to reach out to this friend and learn more about it. And I'll never forget, sitting on her bed that one day, just crying to her saying that I really want to learn to be happy from within, gain happiness for myself and not rely on anyone else externally for that. And I remember she responded, hey, this practice is totally for you. And so, I went to a meeting with her. I met all of these, really open and friendly people who were just so receptive of me and kind of where I was coming from. And to the point where it really almost felt like a second family. And I just started to really experiment with the practice until I started to, really see some actual benefits in my life.
And Kate, before we get to those benefits, I really want to linger for a second on this idea of finding happiness from within, right? I think that's from my understanding, a very core tenet, certainly to Buddhism and possibly to every or certainly many spiritual traditions. And it's in contrast, I think, to a lot of the way that we're often brought up to think, or maybe just influenced to think in the environment that we're in, where we're looking around, we see people accomplishing things. We assume that happiness comes from that accomplishment or comes from, something that's happening in our external world. And it's really a pretty big shift, right? To see that, hey, like this is an idea that if what your internal experience is actually has primacy over your external experience. And this is actually a theme that I explored a lot myself with Gabe, last year when Gabe was coaching me. And I think, it was a familiar message, but I think there is a practice to actually shifting your orientation towards that. And what I'm curious about, so the question here is, in that moment, where you identified that for yourself, or like, hey, I want to be happy from within. I'm just curious where that framework came from for you, or what made you ready for that in that moment when you actually identified that for yourself.
I think a lot of it came from deriving my self worth and my value based off of what others kind of thought or others perceived of me. And I think that kind of like the second kind of component to that was happiness in that moment kind of felt very fleeting, to your point, Rahul. And so I think for me, I really wanted to reach a point of this like sustainable happiness where, the happiness kind of like that I seek is almost absolute, where it's like living itself is joy, as opposed to the relative happiness, which is really more stimulated by, external factors like a new car or like a new job. And, not saying that those aren't important either, but I think what I was really missing at that point, and something that I kind of still strive for on a day-to-day basis, is like, am I leading like a fulfilling life that's sustainable?
One of the things that stuck out to me about your story that I found myself moved by just now is the relationship with your mom and your mom's participation in this community and her encouragement to you. And when I think back to my own undergraduate years, I just, I feel like that's this, for so many people, it's this black hole in American cultures. We have these like memes or stereotypes. You're supposed to go off to college and have like the best 4 years of your life. And I think what happens for a lot of people is what I heard you describe, it happened for me, which is like a mental health crash. You're suddenly alone. You're in a foreign place and you're tasked as a still developing young person with figuring all of that out. And, I think stereotypes of millennials and younger generations are that we are adrift, that we are more focused on our social communities of peers than on traditions and institutions and families. So I guess I'm just curious if you could comment on that a little bit further, about the relationship with your mom and how that connection helped you move in this direction.
It's one of those things where it's like, growing up, you see her chanting every day in the morning, and really just committing herself to this practice. And then, of course, I feel like at that age, you're like 16 years old, a teenager, your mom tells you to do something and it makes you want to do the opposite direction, go run in the opposite direction. Exactly. But I think, to your point, like being thrust, you're 21 years old and you're, thrust in this new, undergrad college environment, you're building your own life. And I think at that point, it was like my life was really seeking. And on top of that, I truly, believe that my mom's kind of prayer led me to that friend at NYU and that specific moment where she was going to a Buddhism meeting. And I really do feel like it was my mom's prayer that led me there to just, be in the right place at the right time. And I think a lot of that, really came from my mom chanting for my happiness too. There's a big concept around, just like really being in rhythm with the universe. And I feel like when you chant, that is like the basically like the form to getting there. And so I feel like my mom's prayer, really kind of like unfolded the environment for me to be able to embrace this practice in my own way, like when I was ready in in my life.
That's such a beautiful image, and even kind of building off what you said, Gabe, I'm really just visualizing this connection, right, between mother and daughter, and kind of as part of this field of energy in the universe that you were just describing, Kate. And I think, from what it sounds like, between your having been familiar with the practice already, that chance encounter with your friend or acquaintance that was going to that meeting, it seems like there was already like a pathway for you, maybe initially invisible but then suddenly visible, that very naturally took you to this particular community. But just to check in on that once, because I don't want to assume, like, did you consider any other spiritual practices or spiritual communities, I should say, in that early phase, when you were kind of reconnecting with this part of yourself, or maybe connecting for the first time and exploring this particular option? Did you look at other places, or was it just kind of like, no, this felt right, from the get-go because of everything that you've already described?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, I was in a very seeking spirit at that point in my life. So I was, kind of looking for that outlet that would help me find faith and be able to self develop, go through self development. Some of the other practices that I had kind of taken a look at, a lot of their meditation practices were, it was very much focused around kind of like clearing your mind and really just being present, but also just clearing your mind. And I think for me with chanting, when I experimented with it, it felt more like an active form of meditation where I was able to still think about my goals and how I wanted to feel, but with like a very focused determination. And so I think that was one thing that kind of drew me to chanting and Nichiren Buddhism, was just my experimentation with it and how I felt during it. And then of course, like some of the benefits that I really, felt like I was able to manifest in my environment after. I think the other, piece there too is, I grew up Hindu as well, Rahul. And so growing up, we did go to the temple, but I had never, and, while I still, on paper consider myself Hindu, my day to day is really more active with the Buddhist side. And I think part of that is because with Hinduism kind of growing up, I would find myself, going to the temple and doing what felt like for me was more like ritualistic things that I was doing. And I didn't really fully understand the meaning behind a lot of them, even though I do know there's really significant meaning that stems from like Sanskrit around a lot of what Hindu rituals are. But I personally just never had that connection. I think the other piece too is that with Buddhism, they preach that everyone has an enlightened Buddhahood. Everyone has like Buddhahood within themselves already, and unlimited wisdom, courage, compassion to be able to really change their karma. Whereas with something like Hinduism, I felt that I was always, praying to an external being to, manifest something in my life. It was almost like wishing and praying to someone else and giving the power to someone else. As opposed to with Buddhism, I felt like the power was all in me to change my life. I think kind of like those kind of three factors, it really led me to kind of, embrace Nichiren Buddhism and chanting.
Kate, now you've talked about the benefits. We've kind of been mentioning the benefits of the practice as it came to you, and I'm imagining, from what I can understand, that initially getting connected to this community when you finally did was accompanied by a rush of really positive experiences. And please let me know if I'm wrong about that. But I feel like, thinking about my own experiences in different spiritual worlds, that there's sometimes a kind of peak experience or like a really positive experience initially, and then the going gets a little tougher, or it's a little bit more confusing as we get into the sustaining of that and the committing to that. And as you know, I think I spoke to my own self in our introduction. I probably embody some of the kind of lack of commitment or ambivalence about commitment that maybe is a stereotype of younger folks in this generation, and maybe in general. So I'm curious, it seems that your journey has been has developed into a form of commitment and dedication that sustained you over these years. And I'm just curious about that process. How did you get committed? Was it a really active choice, or was it natural? Has there been ebbs and flows to your commitment? And what's that process been like that's allowed you to stay deeply connected to this community over all these years?
That's a really good, I think, call out you mentioned, Gabe, around, you have this almost like honeymoon phase with something new that you're starting, whether it's a new relationship or a new practice. And then as you really, dedicate and commit yourself and time goes on, that's where a lot of, the drop off can happen, or maybe just like a lack of faith or whatever it is. And so, I definitely have felt that. And I think for me, kind of looking back, I feel that my practice has become more profound as the years have gone by and as I have kind of dug deeper into my practice. I think initially, of course, like I was just experimenting with chanting to see if it worked, to see if, changes in my environment were happening. And I remember I like started to notice that the subway came on time every time I walked into the subway platform, little benefits like that, that are definitely, a little more shallow. But then, I think as the practice went on, and as I started to, get older, and as my challenges have started to become, a lot more serious, I think I've found that I've really leveraged the practice to really just change, a lot of my inherent negative tendencies and really sort of try to transform them into more like positive tendencies. So, for example, I feel like over the years, I've been able to use chanting as a way to transform my inherent karma of anger into more like passion, as an example. And I think those are sort of what we call, again, going back to like absolute happiness versus like relative happiness. I do feel like even though relative happiness, benefits occur, I do feel like ultimately what's kind of kept me with the practice, which is a lifelong practice, that of course I will be in some parts of my life, depending on what I'm really challenging, more involved, and other parts of my life when maybe I'm coasting, maybe less involved. But I do feel like at the end of the day, what's kind of kept me going is seeing the benefits in myself and the changes in myself and having that absolute happiness, just on a day-to-day basis.
And that example that you used there, right, turning anger into passion, really speaks to me. I think framework that I often refer back to for myself is this idea that every characteristic or quality that you have, or that someone has, people have in general, has like a desirable side and maybe an undesirable side, right? And I won't call it positive or negative, right? Because I think it just depends on the situation and whatever. But it might be like, hey, for me, it's undesirable to be angry because it, makes me feel bad, or makes other people feel bad, creates situations that I then have to deal with afterwards. Oh, but if I can channel that energy into passion, which is maybe the other side of the same coin, that creates desirable effects for me. And so that example that you used really, again, stands out, right? And I'm just curious if you could go a little bit deeper into what that flip is, internally. Like what does that look like? Like what's happening? How is the practice creating that shift for you internally? And whether it's that example or any others that you might have, I'm just curious to dig a little bit deeper into that experience. And then also if you can paint the picture of the benefits that followed from that internal shift. Would love to just understand that.
I'll actually share a really early experience I had with the practice. I, at that point in my life, was working a really, I guess, like horrible job. It was my first job out of college. I was doing, finance, banking on Wall Street, and, typical toxic cultures, all of that, and felt like a cog in a machine. So I had set a goal to find a new job by, a certain day, and I basically went on a chanting campaign in addition to pairing it with job interviews and resume applications and all of that. I also every day consistently chanted for this new job. And, kept chanting. Nothing was occurring. I was going through interviews, but, really just going through rejections. And I was, I remember being super frustrated at that point. I'm like, why isn't this chanting working? And this was very early on in my practice. And I remember I read this quote that a fellow member in the community had shared with me through SGI. And the quote said, quote, "There are cases when we wonder why benefit doesn't reveal itself in spite of our earnest and high degree of faith. At such times, rather than entertaining doubt, it's better to ask yourself whether you are guilty of these four types of slander, because a person who harbors contempt, hate, jealousy, or grudges will realize no benefits." And, in that moment, I realized that I was completely guilty of all of those slanders. I was harboring jealousy at that point in my life towards my roommates who had much more free time than I did. Their family was close to them. Their, friendships and boyfriends were close to them. I was in a long distance relationship at that time, and I was just feeling very, begrudgingly angry and really harboring this contempt. So after that, I started chanting to transform these negative tendencies rather than chanting for this new job. I said, wow, I really don't want to be, this type of person. So I started really chanting to just transform those negative tendencies. And as I was chanting every day, that's when I started to build more gratitude in my life, maybe start to notice things that occurred in my life that I hadn't noticed before that I really should be feeling a lot of appreciation for. And I really started to feel that from the depths of my bones. I kept kind of chanting and, living my life and still applying for jobs and all of that. And at that point, I remember there had been false rumors going around me about my performance at work. And I was just so discouraged. And I was still chanting to really transform those negative tendencies. And before I handed in my resignation letter, I decided to stand up for myself and confront, the person who was spreading those rumors directly, who then apologized and admitted that it was, false, feedback that was going around about myself. And at that point, an opportunity presented itself in the San Francisco office, and they offered it to me, which was, just like a complete benefit that I had never even thought of. And I ended up taking it and accepting it. And that's how I moved to San Francisco. And, it's not how I expect things to turn out, but it's one of those examples of like your inner state is a reflection, your environment is a reflection of your inner state. And I feel like as I transformed my inner state and really tried to transform those negative tendencies, my environment started to shift to become much more, positive, and then ultimately unfolded this opportunity.
Well, I love that story, and there's so much potency in it to unpack. And it actually brings me back to another example that you shared a little bit earlier, or about the subway coming on time. And this principle of the practice that you named about being in rhythm with the universe. This story, I think, really reflects that, the way that you deepened into your spiritual practice, your personal practice, and then clarified and refined the intent behind the practice, and how, in your experience, then it got linked to some real profound changes in your day to day life and the course of your life. And to me, that's something that I'm personally very sympathetic towards. And I feel that that's had a big influence in my life as well. And I'm also, I feel like I can connect with the skeptic, or the cynic that is like, the subway coming on time because you were chanting. What are you talking about? You can't possibly believe that. I guess I'd be curious if you can just take us a little bit further on that. What does that mean to be? I think you spoke to it already here in your prior answer, but what does that mean to be in rhythm with the universe? And how does building gratitude and the inner fortitude that comes through the practice contribute to that? And then I think you gave an example of how it had played out with your job, but what would you say to that skeptical voice that is like kind of a rationalist and is like concerned with the associations you're making that might feel kind of far-fetched or like a false corollary?
I totally hear you. And I'm a skeptic myself, which is why I just decided to experiment with the practice early on in my practice. And part of that too was also, we have three pillars in SGI: faith, practice, and study. And so faith is having, to your point around kind of being in rhythm with the universe. Faith is having, faith in what we call sort of like, it's called the mystic law, almost like it is essentially like the rhythm of the universe. And this type of Nichiren Buddhism proclaims that every person has the mystic law within themselves inherently. So it's essentially Buddha nature and has their Buddhahood in them. And then it goes to our second pillar, which is practice. And that is the actual practice of chanting every day. And so chanting is sort of like the direct means to getting into rhythm of the universe. And then we have study. So study is essentially taking all of these, material that Shakyamuni Buddha wrote and, Nichiren Daishonin, who was one of the early propagators of this type of Buddhism, taking all that study material and applying it to, modern daily life. It's a way to kind of deepen your practice. And to your point, Gabe, making sure that we're getting very clear about the intent behind our chanting and the intent behind our practice. It's a way to really study and make sure that we are on sort of like the right path and really being accurate about that too. So it's almost like those three pillars and together make up, this practice. What I would say to a skeptic is to really just experiment with it. Chant 1 minute a day, even 30 seconds a day about a goal that you have, like set a goal, set an intention and chant about it and see what it is. And that goal could be, as earthly desire, as much of an earthly desire as I want a new car, to as intrinsic as I really want to transform this, tendency I have of maybe being pompous or maybe being arrogant, as an example. And so it could really be whatever you want. And I would just say, experiment with it, see how you feel as you chant, after you chant, and then kind of just take it from there.
What I really like and what you responded there is the engagement. I think when it comes to skepticism, and it's cool to hear you also have that voice, right? I think it's a healthy part of modern living, right? Is to be a skeptic. The scientific method has gotten us to a lot of places, but then it's not neutral, right? The skepticism is itself a stance that sometimes takes us out of the opportunity to experience something profound, and it almost in my experience, it's like I have to appreciate, love, respect my skeptic, but I also have to go past him to tap into those rhythms you're talking about, to tap into to begin to approach that experience of living itself as joy that you named. And skepticism by itself doesn't, from just my perspective, but it doesn't totally allow us to do that. And that's part of why spirituality and practices such as this are so vital and important in continuing to be in the era that we live in. That's kind of just that's there's no question in there. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but that's kind of what I'm sitting with from your share.
Gabe, it is important to question. Like we always, whenever I introduce someone to the practice or if someone wants to learn more about it, I always encourage them to ask as many questions as possible because I want their inner skeptic to come out so we can have a really just open dialogue about it. And then like really encouraging them to experiment with it on their own pace and whatever's like most comfortable for them, I think is really important. I think it is important to always question and, make sure that the values are sort of aligned with your internal values too of the practice. But then to your point, Gabe, having an open mind and making sure that inner skepticism doesn't stop you from potentially seeing a new, potentially, experiencing something new or seeing a new side of something you hadn't seen before. I think it's just really important. It's just the way to continue to keep growing, I guess.
I love this notion of experimentation, that you've come back to a few times, and even this skepticism being a part of that experimentation rather than something to just put aside. And so just tracking the whole flow that I'm seeing here, right? I think you started by saying this idea of like, hey, like I was ready, right? I was in a seeking place, and that created the fertile ground in which I could plant the seed of a spiritual practice, right? And then from there, you actually did consider other practices, but it was really this idea of finding the practice that really speaks to you, right? And that might be different for each person. We obviously have different sensibilities, different levels of exposure, to other practices. But I guess running with that analogy, it's like finding the right seed, right? The seed that speaks to you, that grows into the fruit or the plant that you want or that you connect with. And so there's readiness, there's finding the practice that speaks to you, and then there's what we've just been talking about, right? Then there's engagement, there's experimentation, there's actually seeing what the practice is and practicing, and doing it and collecting data, right? And seeing how we feel, seeing what it does, experiencing the benefits, experiencing maybe some of the pitfalls, right? Or some of the possible challenges with a particular practice or a community. And just following that train, so now where I'm at is, hey, I've picked this thing, I'm experimenting with it, right? And now I kind of want to get into this idea of like what comes next, right? And so you've mentioned that you have had, some varying levels of commitment to the practice. I know Gabe was talking about that with Run Shui as well. And so, Kate, and when we talked a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned, hey, currently with things that have been happening, you got married and work and this and that, like maybe business has come in and you maybe have been less active than other seasons of your life. How do you navigate that, right? Like, what does it look like once you've experimented, once you've maybe picked something that you like, to stick with it, right? And to roll with the seasons and the waves of life and the tensions maybe in your day to day and your environment and whatever it might be. And so how do you approach that, right? Both in terms of mindset, in terms of what your actually actions you're taking, in terms of bringing yourself back and not feeling like you're maybe falling off the wagon. So yeah, a lot of things there, but just we'll turn that over to you and curious what comes to you there.
Yeah, definitely. I think, for me, this is a lifelong practice that's going to ebb and flow. It's always going to be a tool that I have to come back to in those moments of my life where I feel like, I need to challenge something in my life, or I need to, I'm coming across this big challenge in my life and I really need to, use my practice as a way to overcome this obstacle. It's always going to be there. But I think, kind of to answer your question, and I think Gabe may have touched on this earlier around, make how to incorporate this into, your day to day. It's really, up to the individual and like what's most important for them. I think, what they're going through at that specific point in their life. When I had found this practice, I, was going through a lot of challenges personally, and I really wanted to use this practice to be able to overcome those obstacles. And, I find, in my past 8 years of practicing, I find that, whether it's obstacles around a job, or I'm really challenging my marriage, my upcoming marriage, and all of the family dynamics that are coming into play. Like I can find myself, chanting up to, 2 hours a day. But then in other parts of my life where, I feel like I want to, maybe take a little break from the self development and kind of take maybe a step back and just what we call, coasting in a way. I feel like, maybe I'll chant just a few minutes a day. It really just depends on like what I'm going through specifically at that point in my life. But I really value it as something that I will always come back to. I think the other thing there too is that it is a community. So we do meet with our like specific neighborhood a few times a month. There's always meetings that are happening. And so I love attending meetings to deepen my practice. And then also as a way to kind of come back to the practice whenever I want to, or whenever I need to. I've met so many people through this practice, practicing in New York, practicing here, that, I still keep in touch with and I still see. I've been exposed to people I wouldn't have been exposed to if I didn't have this practice, outside of my typical social circles, which I have really appreciated, just being able to like welcome diverse experiences and people from, diverse backgrounds. Like I really have enjoyed that. So it's always a community that's going to be here for me, and no matter where I move to in the world. And so I really appreciate that, is just having people who are there for me, and then who live the same values, and then having this tool in my pocket when I really face an obstacle in my life.
What I'm picking up from that is that there is an ebb and flow to your practice, and that's something that you feel at peace with, and and you see it in the for the long haul. This is a long-term, lifelong practice, as you've said, and so within that, there's going to be these times of more intense practice and less intensity. I'm curious about your contentment and peace with that, because earlier I mentioned we talked about the skeptic, right? Or this kind of create this straw character of like the skeptic. Now I'm noticing another voice, which is kind of the disciplinarian, which is like, well, how do you measure that? Or how can you be certain that you're not fooling yourself, or really that you should be doing it with consistency every day? Or thinking about more in like the Jewish community, more religious practitioners who are like, you daven, you pray every day, at these times. It doesn't matter if you want to do it, you don't want to do it. I'm just thinking about my own experience. I can feel kind of the tension and the confusion, the lack of peace around that, the conflict, inner conflict. And so what I hear in your sharing, and it also seems connected to something that I know that you and Rahul spoke about, a couple weeks ago, which is kind of the relationship of this practice to the notion of desire, worldly desire, and that maybe there's a little bit more of a accepting or positive relationship to desire than we sometimes think about traditionally when it comes to religion and spiritual practices, which often are about the denial of that, or the getting away from worldly desires. How do you find that peace to ebb and flow, that trust that you're moving with the practice as is appropriate for you, and engaging with that kind of strict disciplinarian energy that might question that, or be encouraging or demanding that you take your practice more seriously?
Well, that's a really good question. Like I will add that, in Buddhism, and I've definitely experienced that before, Gabe, kind of like the, disciplinarian, oh, we should be doing this every day. But actually in Buddhism, like there is no guilt, if I forgot to chant yesterday, maybe I would have felt guilty, but actually like, Buddhism preaches like there is no guilt. Like it's always starting from this moment onward. And there is like this quote, to put all our energy into the present moment with great hope for the future. That is the mark of a person who is wise in the way of living. That's a quote from Nichiren Buddhism. That's of course like another reason that has drawn me to this practice, and why I've been able to stick with it the past almost 10 years, is the fact that it feels more sustainable to me, and that we really focus on from this present moment onward. Now, to that point, I definitely do kind of see changes in myself when I'm not chanting, consistently. Like I will see my life condition, will maybe go down, and I can see, my inherent tendencies of anger coming up again more easily than usual. And then in those moments, I'll be like, oh, I got to chant tomorrow, And so it is definitely kind of like an ebb and flow, and just consistently trying to find a balance. But I do see the changes in myself of when I am consistently, practicing and chanting and in rhythm versus not. And of course, I want to be that person who has the higher life condition. So chanting does help me there. So yeah, I think it's all just about like finding, the best rhythm for you that's sustainable and that really kind of fits into your own life. And then also ensuring that that rhythm is allowing you to see the benefits in both your inner life state and your environment as well. I think that's that. Yes, you did mention, this principle that we have in Buddhism, that says earthly desires lead to enlightenment. And, to put this kind of simply, earthly desires is, around suffering and the desires and cravings that maybe may cause suffering because we don't have them, as an example, like a new job or a new relationship. And enlightenment refers to happiness, or just like an enlightened higher life condition, state of life. And what I kind of really like about Nichiren Buddhism is that it essentially like allows us to be able to use these earthly desires and chant for them without any type of guilt or anything, and use that as a way to challenge ourselves and find inherent happiness. Through like my job example I gave earlier, I was able, I may have been chanting for an earthly desire, like a new job, but in the process, I was able to really cultivate myself and, really transform my negative tendencies around anger, etc. And using that as a way to lead to quote unquote enlightenment or, happiness. I think some of the other challenges that or some of the other goals, shall I say, that I've, been use this practice to kind of really challenge and try to achieve around, relationships or all of that. It's really allowed me to, I may have been chanting for like an earthly desire, but it's really allowed me to, in this example, like not derive so much of my sense of value from others, but, bring my own sense of value to the relationships around me, and not looking outside of my own life for something missing. Like, I myself have the power to make myself whole and do whatever I'm really chanting for. And that's really just like a source of like deep joy that I have. And so I really appreciate that this practice allows me and encourages me to chant for these, maybe superficial desires and wants, but is very normal of the human being living in today's society. And in the process, using that as a way to really just transform myself.
This piece was one of my biggest curiosities around this conversation, this piece of like the desires actually being a medium to practice, right? And to practice this process of personal growth and spiritual development. Because for me, I know it's always been a little bit of an unresolved tension, right? This idea that, hey, we should be hungry, we should go after the things that we want, and we should manifest them, and ideally do so with positive intent and service and all of that, but just this general idea of go after the things that you want, right? And make it happen. And then on the flip side, this idea of being content, right? And what you just said around like finding contentment from within and not tying it to those desires, right? And not tying that sense of contentment to the outcome. The way you were describing it is really starting to make that connection for me. But I was wondering if you could speak to it just a little bit more, right? Which is like, how do we not get caught up or get lost in that what might feel like a paradox, right? Or what might be, and maybe this also ties to this idea of like, what are maybe some of the dangers, right, of using earthly or worldly desires as the medium, right? And kind of using that as structure through which the practice is, I wouldn't say anchored, but the practice is being channeled. So just, yeah, curious if there's anything there.
Yeah, I think the thing is like with earthly desires leading to enlightenment, it's this concept of like only by really going through the fire of like problems and suffering can we obtain, like the flames of happiness, like, or like the light and energy of happiness. And so essentially using suffering and like these problems or these challenges and obstacles as like fuel to turn into energy for our happiness. And I really feel like that is kind of like so important in today's society, knowing that there's so much suffering in the world. What is going to allow people to give them faith and hope to kind of overcome a lot of that suffering to kind of like achieve that happiness? It's something like, chanting and having that faith, but then also in the process of chanting, being able to, find that contentment and enlightenment from within. I think like in terms of like what are some of, the drawbacks, I think having blind faith is, a drawback that can be really challenging, which is why we talk about study and why study is so important and it's one of our main pillars. Because you really want to make sure that we don't have just blind faith, that faith is built through something and you're applying the practice in the right way. That's why I really do feel like the practice grows more profound as you delve deep into it more and as you get older, because you're really able to take a lot of that, like, study material and apply it to your practice and going, and it's not like a blind faith that could very easily could be. And then of course with blind faith, when things don't happen, that obviously can cause, issues down the line. So I do think that's where the study kind of really plays in there.
I'm really appreciating the direction of this conversation, and Kate and I'm really grateful just getting to spend this time with you over the past hour, and looking at the time and knowing we're kind of moving towards the end of our conversation today. One of the things that really stands out to me is just the origin story that you shared of the time in your life that you were in when personally discovering and connecting to SGI and this practice. And to me, it's just making me feel, I know that we can be in any walk of life or at any time when it's time for us to encounter a spiritual practice or get committed or become part of a spiritual community. But in particular, this whole conversation today has made me think a lot about young people and myself as a young person, as exemplified by your own experience and journey with that at a young age. And I'm curious, I hope that some young people who are in the position that you were in 8 years ago are going to hear this episode. And I'm curious, particularly to that audience, if there would be any guidance or advice that you would offer. I think a lot of it's been just sprinkled throughout our whole conversation, but anything in particular for young people, especially who are seeking and looking for spiritual practice or community and sorting through some of the same challenges that you yourself experienced, what would you advise them? What would you say to them to help guide them along their own journey?
I do want to say one thing, like they may not know what they're looking for, and that's totally okay. I think the most important thing is to really just keep an open mind, experiment with how the practice makes you feel, ask a lot of questions, be curious, really dig in if there's any type of writings, etc., that you can read about. Be curious, have an open mind, and really like see how it makes you feel, and then see if there are any changes in your day to day with how you're feeling, with what's happening in your life. I think that's kind of like the way to really find a spiritual practice that resonates with you, and then to make it sustainable and, something that is you'll always have and to come back to. Find a way to incorporate it into your life where it just feels very, very normal for you and very easy for you. For me, like chanting in the morning and chanting before I go to bed is something that I've incorporated into my life, and it now feels easy for me. I think in the beginning it was probably more of a disciplinary thing that I wanted to try and incorporate too. But now it feels easy. So think about, what are ways that you can incorporate it into your lifestyle to make it sustainable too. So you can really see the benefits that you want to see out of it.
And so, Kate, now, as we do start to approach the end of this conversation, I think we've been talking a lot about chanting, right? And I think you mentioned up front how chanting being an active practice, versus silencing the mind and that form of meditation was something that really drew you to this particular practice. Would love if you could just briefly speak to why chanting, right? Like, what is kind of the power of chanting specifically? And then also just take us into the sound, right? And what it brings us. And as part of that, if you can share an intention that sort of connects our listeners to what they're hearing so that they can carry that intention as part of the experience of hearing the chant, I think that would be great.
Yeah, so the chanting, the chant itself It's called Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And essentially, it's what it essentially means is I devote myself to the mystic law. I think we talked about the mystic law earlier, this, law of cause and effect and within the universe, permeating in the universe. And so I consider it, like I mentioned, an active form of meditation. So when we do chant, we always say chant with your eyes open and maybe chant to a blank wall if you don't have what we would have as members of the SGI Gohanzon, which is essentially like a scroll of different Chinese and Sanskrit characters that, basically say Myoho Renge Kyo, the mystic law, in different characters. But for those who don't have one, chant to a blank wall where there are no distractions, chant with your eyes open, really be active. And then in terms of like the intention behind it, it's essentially like an expression of determination to really embrace and manifest our Buddha nature. And it's a pledge to yourself to really win over your own suffering. And at the same time, help others reveal their Buddha nature in their lives too and really achieve happiness. Maybe for today, we can have that intention around kind of embracing and manifesting our inherent Buddha nature in each of us. And, I will usually, chant just like this. I go like, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And then I just continue it for as however long until I feel, good and ready to take on the day.
Kate, would you be willing to chant for just a little bit longer for all of us? I think it's really beautiful to hear that intention. And yeah, I just find myself, as is very much connected to the purpose of this show, is deepening, into this, into all of our spiritual journeys, or into our Buddha nature. And I think that's what draws a lot of people to the show. If you're listening in one form or another, we can use different language, but that's really what we are striving for here. And so it's just very powerful hearing your words, and actually maybe as just like a closing, usually I'm saying X or Y or Z to close us out, but actually I'm curious if maybe for slightly longer you'd be willing to just close us out with hearing this powerful words and vibration of the chant, and bring us to a close today that way.
Yeah, definitely. I'll face my scroll right now and I'll ring my bell. Thank you guys so much for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was really energizing for me. So thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, sharing your experience, and just very lucid and so many valuable insights you shared with us today. So I'm sure if you're listening to this too, that I hope you're feeling that way, and just invite you to connect with this chant that we're going to go into here with those intentions that Kate mentioned, which is for your own, wherever you're at in your life, for your own awakening to what's really needed for your own spiritual growth and development. And we're all in that boat together. We're right there with you, and grateful to be getting to do it with you. So thanks again, Kaitna. It's been awesome being with you today.
Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, 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 Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you.